This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Born in Pittsburgh, Micahel Luo is the son of Chinese immigrants. He attended Harvard and later became a reporter at the New York Times. And today, he is the executive editor at The New Yorker. One raining afternoon in 2016, he was standing on the sidewalk with his family and some friends after church, trying to decide where to go to lunch when a stranger accosted him and his family. "Go back to China," she said. Today, Micahel joins us for the hour to talk about his experience and his new book, Is Strangers in the Land: Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of the Chinese in America. You can find a link to it on our website at ctpublic.org/wherewelive. Micahel, thank you so much for joining us today.
So excited to be here.
And for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions or if you would like to share your own stories. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Micahel, I actually want to start with the introduction that you have in Strangers in the Land, because you recall the moment that led you to begin writing this book. And as we mentioned just now, it was in 2021. You had a personal experience. It's sort of at the height of the pandemic and also the rise of anti-Asian hate and violence. And apologies for asking you to sort of relive trauma, but could you give us an idea of the personal and the political context that made you decide that this was the right time to write this book?
Yeah. Just one timeline corrective. So this incident happened in the fall of 2016. So it was before the pandemic. It was just before Trump was elected. It was a few weeks away from the election. And we weren't expecting this. I don't think very many people were. But you could feel this curtain of nativism descending on the country. And this incident happened to me. In some ways, it's just a normal encounter. It was pretty intense. After the woman, she was basically aggravated at me and my friends who were standing in the way on the sidewalk, and she muttered, "Go back to China." And then I kind of got in her face a little bit, and we were going back and forth, and she ended up yelling down the street, screaming at the top of her lungs, "Go back to your effing country." And I was trying to come up with this retort, and the adrenaline's flowing, and I said, "I was born in this country," and I ended up becoming a bit of a viral thing. I was tweeting about it, and I used this hashtag, "This is 2016," because I was just lamenting the fact that this was the year 2016, and this kind of thing was still happening. And I was at the New York Times at the time, and I wrote a piece that night, an open letter to this woman, talking about this feeling of otherizing that is a pervasive one in the Asian American experience. And I wrote about this kind of sadness I felt as I was walking away that afternoon, pushing my younger daughter in a stroller, and my older daughter was walking next to me, just thinking about how my kids are 2 generations removed from my parents' immigrant experience. And I was just wondering if they would ever feel like they truly belonged. And that moment turned into just kind of a week-long series of conversations. It felt like the New York Times did this direct-to-camera video where dozens of Asian Americans sent videos in talking about their own experiences, and that became its own viral thing. I was on MSNBC and doing panels, and one thing I realized, because I was just basically a regular person thrust into this position. I joked that I was the face of Asian America for a few weeks, but one thing I realized was when I was on these panels and doing these conversations, I felt ill prepared. I felt a little bit of imposter syndrome of not able to really talk in depth about the Asian American experience and this history, and that stuck with me. And fast forward, I went to the New Yorker a couple weeks later, and I had a very busy job, and then the pandemic happened, and obviously this was this incredible searing period when Asian Americans felt unsafe, often walking on the street. And I wrote a piece for the New Yorker soon after the Atlanta spa attacks, when several Asian immigrant women were killed by a white gunman. And I drew on a few books that have been written about some of this history, particularly this period of time that I knew nothing about, called the driving out, which was 1885, 1886, when dozens of communities, I think the count is something like 168 communities on the West Coast, drove out the Chinese from their communities. And I just wrote about that we've been told to go back to our country for nearly 200 years. And there is this precarity in the Asian American experience that can be traced back to the 19th century, and you can draw a line all the way to present day.
Well, I think we're going to go sort of back and forth in timeline here, because touching on this idea of, I mean, you just mentioned it now, that this is something that's been happening since the 19th century, and yet we're still having this conversation today. And I'm curious to hear, your children were younger then versus now, a couple of years later. Did you have a conversation with them at the time versus today? How is it different?
Yeah, I remember actually my older daughter, who's 16 now, almost analyzing it grammatically. She was like, she was saying, she kept repeating, why did she say go back to your country, go back to China, we're from here, or go back. She was trying to analyze it. Mm-hmm. It wasn't computing. And you could see in a child's struggle to understand that kind of naivete about, the world, and just this innocence about it. Today my kids are 11 and 16, and I've just gotten done with. I went to 9 cities in 9 days for my book tour. The launch event for my book, Strangers in the Land, was at the Museum of Chinese in America in New York. And it was this incredible moment. It was standing room only. Min Jin Lee, the novelist, the author of Pachinko and Free Food for Millionaires, was my conversation partner. And it just felt incredibly emotional. There was so much energy in the room. There's this, I think the experience of Asian Americans often is one of invisibility, and this idea that somebody was telling their story was just really, really powerful. And so it's been a privilege to have my kids see that. It's very rare that kids get to see their dad at work and their parents at work, and then also for them to absorb this history and to think about and talk about it. My 16-year-old is a little bit, she's a teenager. She has AP exams, and she's a teenager. I asked her when on the day of publication, when the New York Times wrote a lovely review, and I sent it to her, and asked her later if she had read it. She's like, Dad, it was really long. But my 11-year-old has been trying to read my book. Every day she brings it. It's kind of a, it's a real book. And she puts it in her backpack and she brings it to school, and her and another Asian American friend of hers are reading it together. And it's an incredible thing.
That is incredible, considering the book is probably half of her backpack.
It's a lot. It's a lot. I will say that it's 160,000 words with 40,000 words of endnotes. So there's a big chunk of the back of the book that are endnotes that she doesn't have to fully digest. But she's like roughly halfway through, and I love that. And I think it speaks to how I tell this story with characters and scenes, and there's real narrative momentum, and she's kind of pulled into it, which is the greatest gift that I can get from readers at this point.
I'm not gonna lie, I did shudder a bit when you said AP exams. It just kind of took me back a little bit. Wasn't expecting that today. But
we're right in the middle of it. We're right in the middle of it.
Yeah. Right. Challenging times, definitely. And I do not envy your daughters. But I want to reflect on your daughter's experience reading the book, because I think we collectively here had the same experience where we started reading it and said, okay, there's a lot of facts, as you should, being a historical context here, but we found ourselves kind of turning the page and turning the page and turning the page. And similar to what you were saying earlier, my own experience was, why don't I know this? And this does seem to be a common theme when we're having these conversations today about a lot of our past history, especially with the AAPI context. And you mentioned just now that you were able to find these people, find these characters, and of course you've combed through a lot of archival information to find the stories with so much historical context. Can you give us an example or just describe how you were able to zero in on the people that you ended up focusing on in the book, which was many?
Mm. Yeah, so I'll say two things. One is when I started out the book and I pitched this book to my publisher, Doubleday, I initially pitched it as it'll do for Chinese migration what Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of Other Suns did for the Great Migration. And I had this idea that I would center it on a couple of families, maybe, we're now, people can trace their families back 5 generations, some people 6 generations in America, Chinese families. And I thought I might be able to do that. And I basically found fairly quickly that this was going to be impossible to build around just a few families, because even with the oral histories, if you know your story of your family going back 5 generations, you might know 3 facts about that great 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 grandfather, and it's just not enough. And so I thought of the book. When you're a narrative writer, you think of protagonists, and I wound up thinking about the Chinese people as a whole as the protagonists of the story, and you hopefully are drawn along in this narrative. There's a kind of in Chinese history, what I saw was this narrative arc of these people who are initially welcomed, confronting this kind of rising series of complications, tests, the things that tested their resilience, and the emotional heart of the book is this driving out period where people were physically trying to expel them from their communities and the country, and yet they didn't succeed. And ultimately, the resolution is a story of persistence and resilience. In each chapter, though, I try to build around a character or characters. And one good example of that is the Los Angeles Chinese Massacre is a chapter. This happened in 1871. It's one of the worst. It may be the worst mass lynching in American history. Didn't involve Black Americans. It involved Chinese immigrants. It was 17 Chinese men were lynched, and an 18th man was killed in a different way. And it was so important for me to say their names, to tell their stories as much as possible. And we know their names because there are coroner's reports, and there was a trial. No one was convicted. There are newspaper articles, but it's hard to build them out as 3-dimensional characters. But there was a guy named Gene Tong who was an herbalist, and he treated not just Chinese patients but white patients. And you knew that he rented this store or this storefront from a white furniture dealer, because your classified ads that had his name in it, and I knew that he had a wife, which was unusual actually among early Chinese immigrants. And I knew he had a roommate. I knew there was a signboard outside his apartment and office, and I knew he had a pet poodle, which was just a lovely humanizing detail. And the reason I knew that is after he was lynched, and there were these multiple accounts of his lynching, and actually I had to sort out my best judgment of how exactly he was killed. There was a newspaper reporter who, from one of the Los Angeles papers, that went through his apartment. It was completely torn apart. They ransacked his belongings. They were looking for valuables, and they found there was blood everywhere. And they found this whimpering poodle dog with a broken leg there, and that's how I knew that. And that's a little glimpse of how I try to tell these stories and make the Chinese protagonists in the story.
Well, and so there's an era, I think, in history that perhaps many of us will be more familiar with, which is the gold rush. And of course, you've dug into that both in spaces that are familiar and unfamiliar with. But how do we know how news of the gold rush reached China and some of the first immigrants that came to America? Because this is also the time in history where there's a huge immigration boom with the Irish and German immigrants also coming to the United States.
Yeah, so I wanted in my first chapter or the introduction of the book to have a kind of, I don't know, patient zero, like the first Chinese like who was here. And there actually is, and it seems to have been passed down through Chinese lore in the community. There was a newspaper article again decades later, actually, a San Francisco Chronicle reporter sets out to discover, as he put it, and this is the racist language of the time, how the Mongolian octopus had secured its tentacles around the city. There were so many Chinese immigrants in San Francisco, and he's setting out to tell readers how this happened. And so he goes to one of the Chinese mutual aid societies, which existed. There were these geographic mutual aid associations that helped Chinese immigrants from that particular geographic locale. And they told this story of this a guy named Cheng Ming, who was a merchant who had been here in 1847, which would have been really early, actually. And there's no documentation that shows that he was here, like no ship manifest or anything like that. But as the story goes, that he was here and he went into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada when news broke of the gold to be found in the foothills, and he wrote a letter home to a guy named Cheng Yum, a fellow villager in the Sanyi district in Guangdong province, and this guy told other people, and then he set out himself, and so it's a pretty cool story. I don't know exactly if it's true. It seems to have not just in this Chronicle article, but it seems to have passed down through oral history. There is another more verifiable fact that there was a ship that arrived in Hong Kong on Christmas Day in 1848, and it was carrying some gold dust that the Hudson Bay Company wanted to get evaluated by British experts in China, and the ship also had newspapers from Hawaii that had news of the gold rush. And basically what we know is that word spread throughout the Pearl River Delta, and which is in southeastern China. And really this parcel of land, particularly in Taishan, this kind of parcel of land, the size of the analogy I use, it's apt for your show, is the size of Connecticut. Really became the center of this migration, and people think that it's because there was some exposure to the West in this area. There were traders that would pass through Hong Kong and Canton or Guangzhou, as it's known today, and that might have been one of the reasons that these particular people were willing to venture across the ocean or comfortable doing this. I mean, there's incredible stories. I have, as I mentioned, a 16-year-old, 11-year-old, and these were teenage boys, often 13 years old, 14 years old, in ship holds for weeks, coming to this. This is the Wild West. This is the American West. And I just can't imagine the way we raise our kids today, the idea that they could be landing on this shore where they don't speak the language and making a life. It's incredible.
Well, I mean, I did just admit earlier that I shuddered at an AP exam reference, so I cannot imagine myself in a ship. probably stuck in there for hundreds of days before, if you even reach shores on the other side of the world. And earlier we mentioned that there were Irish and German immigrants coming to the U.S., also large numbers, also faced discrimination. But because of race, the Chinese immigrant experience seemed to have been different. And you had talked about how initially it was very welcomed, but that really changed, as we continue to have this conversation. What can you tell us about the lives of the early immigrants and how Chinese immigrants were able to build communities, but then kind of see that disintegrate?
Yeah, it's really interesting because in the early days, when they first arrived in San Francisco, there was a welcoming ceremony held by city leaders and also pastors. They were interested in evangelizing the Chinese, and they held this ceremony. There was also a scene when James Polk, the president, had died, and there was a funeral for him. And the Chinese actually in San Francisco, it was actually weeks after he passed, and the Chinese marched in this parade to remember him, and so there was this period of welcome, and there was an article in the Daily Alta, which was the first daily newspaper in California, that predicted that one day, the Chinese would be voting and in the halls of Congress, and really just like any other American. I think it's when their numbers really just start to rise, and it's a gradual thing. You're tracing incidents in the minefields, ugly episodes of violence that became more common, and there was also the other big, well-known story of the Chinese in America is the building of the railroad, which happened in the 1860s. And this was an incredible accomplishment. And there seemed to be this brief window of time where they could be, that could be a way of catapulting them into the mainstream of society. But that really was very quickly snuffed out. I think economics was a big part of the story. There was they know it today as the Great Depression. Before the Great Depression of the 1930s, there was it basically blanketed the country in the 1870s. It was particularly, there were tens of thousands of unemployed white laborers in San Francisco. And that's when the anti-Chinese movement, which had been percolating in the 1860s, late 1860s, after the building of the railroad, and just really started to take off. And there was, you saw these organizations there were mentions of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was this was this period after where Reconstruction was being vanquished in the South, and you saw the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan terrorizing Black Americans in the South. And there were a few episodes involving the Ku Klux Klan on the West Coast, not very many. But there was this other organization called the Order of Caucasians. Its aim is pretty apparent from its name, and so you just start to see those kinds of organizations and movements take off. There was a demagogish figure, a guy named Dennis Carney, who started to give in the late 1870s these. He had these massive rallies in the Sandlot in San Francisco near City Hall, where he would, in front of thousands of people, he would end his rallies with this shout of "The Chinese must go." And that's the arc of how you get from the gold rush to I think the other major thing that people know is in 1882 the passage of a law that banned Chinese laborers from entering the country, and that is known today as the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so it's interesting. It happened over kind of decades before this law was formally passed, and it's something that historians puzzle over, like what exactly took so long for this to a law to pass, and it's that's one of the things that I try to explore in that section of the book.
And we'll be continuing exploration of that arc after a quick break here. With us for the hour is Micahel Luo. He's the executive editor at The New Yorker and author of the book Strangers in the Land. Micahel will also be giving a book talk at the Mark Twain House this week. And just a quick note for our listeners that the Mark Twain House is an active Connecticut public sponsor. You can also join the conversation. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, author Micahel Luo joins us to talk about his new book, Strangers in the Land, Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of the Chinese in America. So, Micahel, earlier we ended the segment by starting to talk about the Exclusion Act and a lot of the Chinese experience as they sort of navigate a different land. And in the book, you talk about the term illegal immigrant. What did you learn about the origin of this term?
I mean, the Chinese were everything that you're seeing today is you saw with the Chinese. Basically, there was the way the Chinese exclusion law worked was they banned Chinese laborers from entering the country. And the Chinese, though, were creative in evading these laws. And the other thing to know is that the immigration authorities, the customs officials, they were the ones who were regulating immigration in the beginning, were also interpreting the law arbitrarily and basically saw it as their job to prevent all Chinese from entering. And so you have two things going on. You have a people who want to enter and are searching for a better life. They're taking advantage of the ways that they can still enter. You could be a merchant and you could still enter. And so there are all these things that using this absurd menu of physical characteristics that Chinese inspectors were looking for to prove that somebody was a laborer. And, some of it might be true and useful, and others parts of it are absurd. The other thing that really started to happen was if you were native-born American, you could enter the country. You're an American citizen. And you started to see in the late 19th century a rise in people coming in claiming native-born status. And this, after the earthquake of 1906 in San Francisco, which destroyed the city's vital records, this tactic really started to take off, and it was just very difficult to establish if somebody was or was not an American citizen. A separate discussion is the way that citizenship is contested and who deserves to be an American. In the case of Wong Kim Ark in the late 19th century, which he was born in San Francisco. Eventually the inspectors in San Francisco acknowledged that he was born there, but the Justice Department advanced a test case, making this argument that obviously is familiar today, that the 14th Amendment, which says that anyone who's born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof is a citizen. And there was this novel legal argument that was advanced by this, to me, seems a little kooky, a guy named George Collins, who was a San Francisco lawyer, who tried to argue that the native-born children of Chinese immigrants were not subject to the jurisdiction thereof of the United States because their parents were controlled by the Chinese Empire. The Supreme Court rejected this argument and established the legal precedent of birthright citizenship today. But this kind of cat and mouse game of Chinese trying to enter and immigration officials keeping them out, and this apparatus that was built to keep them out and then detain them, and then over time interrogate them at length. This is the story of Angel Island. They needed a place to hold these Chinese immigrants that were landing on American shores, and they needed time to interrogate them, to go through their records, interview people, and so they started holding them on Angel Island, which some people think of as the Ellis Island of the West Coast, but it was a very different experience there. People were detained for weeks, months, even years at a time. And so you just saw this, all these things that we see today, the immigration apparatus that we have today can be traced back to an effort to keep Chinese out.
Well, and just building on what you just shared here, especially since in terms of the exclusion law, the first time in history in the United States that the U.S. had closed the doors for people based on their race, and of course you just made the parallel to present day. Was the paralleling a surprise to you?
Yeah, I mean, what I say in the book. So the book's title is as Strangers in the Land. And I take that from a Supreme Court decision where a Justice Field writes about the Chinese upholding one of these Chinese exclusion laws. He describes the Chinese as strangers in the land and says they're impossible to assimilate with our people. And what I say in the book, and I've been writing about it for the New Yorker, is this is not just the story of the Chinese in America. It's the story of any number of immigrant groups who have been treated as strangers in the land, who are being treated as strangers, and it's really the story of our diverse democracy. It's the story of us. The parallels are just uncanny. That it's just. And that's what I want people to take away from the book is this. I think there are very real policy discussions to be had about immigration and how it's handled, and the thing that we just have to be careful about, and the thing that happens that you see again and again in American history, is how these discussions tip over into racist, ugly feelings.
Well, and we sort of touched on this a little bit earlier too, where sort of there's a Connecticut angle to this, incredibly, with the Chinese educational mission, who brought a lot of Chinese boys, Chinese students, to come and study here during that time frame, sort of late 1800s, early 1900s, and you dedicated a chapter in your book on this sort of journey and experiences that these boys went through. And we follow many real life characters throughout your book, and many have sort of gone back and forth between China and the U.S., and many of them also ended up living here permanently. But there was a thread that I found as you were describing their experiences, especially the way you end some of their chapters, sort of chapters of their lives, is the common sentiment for Yung Wing, for example. He was one of the students with the Chinese educational mission who was here in Connecticut. So you end his chapter with, he was a man without a country. And another person that you mentioned earlier, Wong Kim Ark, whose landmark Supreme Court case affirmed the principle of birthright citizenship, and you ended his chapter with, the country to which he ostensibly belonged never stopped treating him with suspicion. And so following along the thread that we've been talking about here, where we're talking about people from the past, but still very much feeling their presence in the present time. So do you, maybe personally or professionally, see or feel that sense of disconnection today?
I keep getting asked this question of, are you optimistic? and I think that's a little bit of what you're talking about, is what's the trajectory of the Asian American experience. And Is it a this stranger phenomenon? How set in stone is it? I'm optimistic because one, I think I have no other choice. I think I'm, my response to this is to write this book, to write as a part of trying to write us into American history. I also, as I mentioned, I see the trajectory of the Chinese immigrant experience as one of resilience and persistence. And at some of my events, I've asked how many people in the audience can trace their Chinese people of Chinese descent in the audience can trace their stories back to the 19th century. In many places, it's not very many people raise their hand. In San Francisco, you see a ton of people stood up, and I've asked that people applaud them because it's an incredible story. So the thing that what's going on today? So today, the Asian immigrants are projected to become the largest immigrant group in the United States in a few decades. What we're seeing today is China is a juggernaut, an economic, military juggernaut, technological juggernaut. The thing that I worry about is politicians from both parties. Really, it's kind of in vogue to be tough on China, and whenever I hear right now when I'm thinking about this, I hear Trump's China in my head, and whenever I hear that, though, and the thing is, my story, my parents' story is they were born in mainland China. My dad's dad, my grandfather, was a general in the Kuomintang, the KMT, which was fighting the communists, and in one of the final battles in Yunnan province, my grandfather disappeared. He's presumed killed. So he was killed by the communist army. And when I talked to my parents about the threat of China and communist China, that there's a very real, they feel it, and at the same time, every single time I hear that kind of bellicose language, I shudder because the tinder of racial suspicion is just rising at every single moment when that comes up. And I just think that we're at a dangerous point because of China's rise at this point.
Well, and we got to go to break soon here, but as you were sort of describing all of the experiences, I just had a thought of, I think the power of your book is the fact that it exists today, that we're having a conversation about it today. And I kind of want to go back to earlier in the conversation when we talked about your own personal experience with what happened to you in New York, where a woman had accosted you and your family. Do you think that was the start of your own story or the catalyst of a story that's been ongoing, in the sense of, because you felt the need to respond, and it takes a lot to want to respond in that moment?
Yeah, I think another formative moment in my journey to this book is I read Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu, which is a wonderful book, novel published in 2020, around the same time as pandemic period. And folks who haven't read it, I highly recommend it. The main character is a background actor in a television show about a black cop and a white cop, and it's called Black and White. And he is generic Asian man, and his biggest aspiration in life is to become kung fu guy in this show. And there's no place in this show for a multifaceted, nuanced Asian character. And if it's not obvious, his book is kind of an indictment of the way race in America is often viewed through the lens of black and white. And he has this line where he's litigating his case in a courtroom, and he says, "Who gets to be an American?" And that's a central question in my book. And he goes on. He says, "We keep falling out of the story, even though we've been here nearly 200 years." And that's what I'm trying to do. Is I'm trying to write us into that story.
My guest today is Micahel Luo. He's the executive editor at The New Yorker and author of the new book, Strangers in the Land. Let us know if you have any questions. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we've been talking to Micahel Luo. He's the executive editor at The New Yorker and author of the book Strangers in the Land. So, Micahel, we've been kind of going back and forth, past and present, and bringing it back sort of in the more present time. It's been a little over 5 years since the start of the COVID pandemic. What do you want our listeners to know better about the violence against the AAPI community today?
I use a term in the book where I describe the Asian American experience, and I talk about its precarity. And I like that word more and more because it speaks to the fact that I think for the Asian American experience, just as it is for all immigrant groups and ethnic groups and racial groups, it can be multiple things at once. In the course of this book tour in San Francisco, I did this event. It was a private event, and it was for Asian American founders and leaders, and it was a room full of incredibly successful, powerful Asian American people, and and it's true that that is part of the Asian American story. The thing that the model minority myth, as it's known, obscures is the tremendous variation in the Asian American story. The fact that there is Asian Americans have the largest income inequality of any ethnic or racial group, and the thing that I think what the pandemic showed us, and I think what history shows us, is at any moment that this feeling of you don't belong here can return, and it's just lurking there, and it's been there for 200 years, and I think it'll continue to be there for the foreseeable future. The thing that I also come away with is this book is about this early experiment in multiracial democracy that took place on the West Coast. Everyone knows about the debate and over slavery that consumed the Eastern Seaboard. At the same time this was happening, on the West Coast, they were experiencing something that America had never experienced up to that point. There were Black Americans, there were Chinese migrants, there were Californios. They were these Mexican settlers who became citizens after California was annexed. There were indigenous people. There were white immigrant groups, white Americans. And it was a test of multiracial democracy that America had not experienced up to that point. And we didn't do particularly well in that test. And what I take away is that difference is hard. Difference is hard in our personal lives. It's hard in our workplaces. It's hard in churches. There's a reason why churches are on Sunday morning, and as Martin Luther King says, the most segregated time in America. And it's hard in our country, in our democracy. And I think it requires real work, real intentionality, real deliberation of what is underlying our policy discussions. And we just have to be aware of, history doesn't repeat itself, as Mark Twain famously said. It rhymes, and we have to be aware of what came before.
Well, and with that in mind too, got about 2 minutes here to talk about how do we break that cycle. We've explored incidences of violence and exclusion that creates generational trauma from the 19th century, but we're having this conversation today. How can we break that cycle?
So I don't have any huge answers. I think one thing I've said is I want people to read, which I'm concerned about these days. As people's attention spans, I'm thinking about my kids, seems to be shorter every day. And I think the ability to publish these kinds of stories and to have them disseminated in popular culture, books aren't the only way for this story to be told, for the message that Asian American history is American history to get out there. There's obviously film and television. There's podcasts and radio and yeah, I just think that the as I mentioned earlier, it's invisibility that Asian Americans are struggling against, and so the ability to talk about it here and elsewhere, and for I hope many years to come, is my effort to fight that.
Well, and I've talked about before, too, if you told a teenage Kat that adult Kat was going to have so much more Asian American related media in her adult life, she'd be like, are you crazy? We've got about 30 seconds here left. I still want to ask, this is such a big feat, literally, to accomplish your book. It's quite the tome. What would you say you're the most proud about being able to do this today?
I'm most proud that it hangs together as a narrative. That's the thing, is what everyone is. My first sign that I had pulled this off was my dad, who English is not his first language. Mm-hmm. He became the first person to finish a draft of the book when it was just printouts. My family, we go to my parents' house on July 4th week, and they live in New Jersey and near Princeton, and it was just a pile of printouts, and he just picked up one printout, the first chapter, and he just started reading, and then he picked up the second, and then he just kept. I left the folder with him, and he just kept reading, and he finished the book, and it was my first sign that I'd done it, that I'd pulled off what I was trying to accomplish narratively.
Well, that seems to be the collective experience with us here, your daughter, and now your dad. So thanks, Dad, for that encouragement. You've been listening to Micahel Luo, who's the author of the book Strangers in the Land, Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of the Chinese in America. Thank you so much, Michael, for spending time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Michael will also be having a book talk this week at the Mark Twain House. And quick note for our listeners that the Mark Twain House is an active sponsor of Connecticut Public. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.